obtaining soil samples early to get the soil samples into the laboratory at that early phase is now becoming quite a critical path.
Welcome to the Ground Investigation Podcast, a show featuring interviews and insights from leaders in the geotechnical and geo-environmental business world. Join host Michael Taylor as he discusses the ups and downs of running a business in the GI industry, getting geological experts to share their learnings and lessons, as well as their plans for the future, highlighting what they think will improve the ground investigation industry moving forward. Now, here is your host, Michael Taylor.
Welcome to the podcast where we dig deep but keep it light, exploring a fascinating world of ground investigation. Today's special guest is Simon Faulkner, the mastermind behind towering wind projects of the Garden of Seafloor with Wood Thilsted. With 20 years under his belt, spanning continents, climates and considerable challenges, Simon has more tales than a seasoned pirate. So let's unearth the secrets of offshore wind and maybe find some buried treasure in the wisdom of renewable energy. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good to be here.
Excellent. So I was wondering if you could start. Can you describe the transition from geotechnical engineer or engineer geologist to a leadership role and how it shaped your approach to project management?
Yes, I guess the first transition for me was actually moving into the ground engineering business. I actually came into the industry relatively late as a second career. I spent my first 16 years working in the dockyard in Plymouth before deciding it was time to make a change. The actual transition from, like you mentioned, an engineer into a management role has been, it's followed a pretty typical timeline based on experience and the advancement of grey hairs. However, I did actually spend my apprenticeship time stood behind many drill rigs in the rain, in the mostly not so sunny southwest of England, and then now and then in Galway in Ireland. Before I actually then moved to the Netherlands to take on an offshore site manager's role, which was then the actual step up from being an engineer into a management role. I then moved into project management whilst working in Australia, and then moved up again into package manager roles during my time here in Taiwan. The final move, I guess, is the move up into the country manager role, which kind of fell into my lap, so to speak, because the previous incumbent decided it was time to relocate back to Europe after time in Taiwan. And as I did have the most grey hairs at the time, I just walked into the role.
So you're working in the dockyards before that, and then you went to do a degree?
Yes, I went to Plymouth University and did an applied geology degree there, and then went on to partake a master's degree at the Campbell School of Mines.
I mean, I was quite a late bloomer when it comes to getting into the kind of engineering geology field as well. Kind of very late going to university. Eventually realised I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. I can do something else.
Yeah.
Definitely more interested in what I was doing, at least. What has been your most challenging project to date, and how did you overcome any obstacles to date?
I think it's pretty much safe to say that there's always going to be numerous candidates for the most challenging project title. And I guess that depends on the challenges that you're actually facing. As an example, from a logistics perspective, I found working in remote locations is always a bit of a challenge. I project managed a job in the Kimberley region in northwest Australia, for instance, that required a borehole to be drilled to about 1,500 meters. And that was located in the outback. And the initial access was only by using helicopter from Broome, which was 60 kilometers away. So before anything even happened on that project, we actually needed to build a road into the outback. And in Australia, that then needs to comply with all sorts of very strict environmental requirements, and also needs to consider the needs of the traditional landowners. And I remember that the actual environmental management plan it alone took about 4 months to complete and have approved by the authorities. So, that was certainly a challenge. I think if I look at my time here in Taiwan, and likewise any other emerging market, looking at what the offshore wind industry was back in 2016 when I first came here, there was certainly a lot of uncertainty around government legislation and how it would be implemented. Things such as permitting, liaising with the local fisheries, importation of vessels, understanding things like withholding tax requirements. All of these things need to be understood and ironed out, I guess, before you can even start considering the actual offshore activities. And I think also, as internationally minded professionals, who many people I work with have worked largely in Europe or in Australia or the United States, for instance. Sometimes we arrive into an emerging markets and you hope or expect that the local supply chain service providers are exactly the same as we previously experienced, which is just never going to be the case. I moved to Taiwan from Australia, for instance, where HSE, especially in the oil and gas sector, is front and foremost in everyone's thinking, certainly when it comes to planning operations. However, it's just not the same in other countries. So you need a lot more time and patience to work with local contractors, for instance, to help them develop HSE management systems, and probably more crucially to ensure implementation. And since I first came here to now, the results have been great, and I've seen huge differences since I started here in Taiwan.
So you mentioned about the contractors that you would use to carry out work based in Taiwan. How do you go around do that? Do you do that by employing kind of the larger companies?
One of the key issues here is the need to localize. So yes, you do have your larger, let's say more globally established contractors who you can use, but then there is also a need to actually use local contractors as well. When I first moved to Taiwan, I actually was employed by one of these local contractors. They'd previously worked with Fugro in Australia on the search for MH370. So they were introduced to me, I was introduced to them, and I worked extensively with them when I was employed by them and subsequently using them as a contractor. And that they are an example of a company that have come a long way in that short period of time, both operationally, the ability to acquire data, the quality side of it, and just the general HSE and the way their operations are planned and managed.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned about kind of how they're planned and managed. What are some of the key challenges of conducting and overseeing the offshore geotechnical investigations, particularly in some of the regions that you work in?
I think the key thing for me, I can look at it from being a project manager on the contracting side, and I can also look at it as being the management from the client side. More from the contracting side, that was my time in Australia, for instance. The challenges with doing offshore operations in Australia are needing to bring vessels into the country, for instance, having to comply with the needs and demands, I guess, of the maritime unions in Australia, having to replace a marine crew, the environmental considerations that need to be in place for, say, for instance, cleaning hulls of vessels to ensure that you're meeting the AQUIS requirements. And then in Taiwan, for instance, the best way of ensuring a smooth operation is to have good contractors. And I think over time, we've actually managed to identify the ones that are really, really good at what they do, which is nowadays most of them. And, if you've got a good contractor in place and you work in a collaborative way with them, then it does help to make a good basis for a good project and successful operations.
In terms of operation challenges, how do the conditions in Taiwan compare to other regions that you've worked in?
I think the key challenges in Taiwan are more associated with stakeholder management. And I think in particular, the requirements of the government departments and also maintaining the good relationships with the local fishery associations. The government does have the strict localization requirements that I mentioned before. So as I said, the pool of available geophysical and geotechnical service providers is a bit limited. So it can be quite challenging when you've got 5 or 6 developers trying to contract the 2 or 3 service providers that are available with both, the project development and engineering timeline pressures to consider. So from an internal perspective, I'm getting told we need to have this data by this date. And then contractors are saying, oh, well, I'm not ready to be able to commit to you yet. Oh, by the way, can you give me a contract? And then you go back internally and say, we need to get a contract. Got to wait for a little bit just to make sure we're going to do it before we actually sign a contract. So it's always that situation of everybody wants everything immediately, but sometimes they're not prepared to actually commit at that particular point in time, which then obviously makes vessel availability and contractor availability sometimes very difficult to actually manage.
Sure. Sounds like there's a lot of moving parts to try and resolve. In Taiwan, is it similar laws as in Thailand? If you employ someone who's foreign national, for instance, do you have to employ several other locals?
No, it's not so much a rule. The office I work in and the company I work for, we have a nice mix of locals and non-locals. I don't think there's any particular requirement to have a certain percentage of locals. When it actually does come to submission of bids for auctions, then developers do need to actually localize according to the government requirements on localization, how much should go to local service providers, companies, consultancies, etc.
So how do you manage the logistics and challenges of nearshore versus offshore site classification?
I think the first thing to help with any logistical planning is to actually use competent contractors and those who have got good local knowledge. It really does make life far easier when it comes to operations running smoothly or not. So in Taiwan, for instance, we will use a local contractor for nearshore operations. They're often needed to attend permitting meetings, planning meetings, information meetings with the local government, the port authorities, landowners, and that's mostly conducted in Mandarin. So it always seems to go a lot more smoothly in Taiwan when you've got Taiwanese talking to Taiwanese. And like anything else in Taiwan, most things can be sorted out over a good dinner. For the offshore side of things, the local port agents are normally pretty good at organising the alongside requirements of vessels in port. And typically the logistical side of things will be managed by the contractor. We use both local and international contractors for these things. There's still some traditional and rather annoying delays in Taiwan. For instance, customs, they still don't work at the weekends. Typically a spare part will arrive in Taiwan on Friday afternoon, and then you've got to wait till Monday morning for it to get its customs clearance for delivery to the vessel. So that adds in some annoying little delays now and then.
So how does the geotechnical investigation phase integrate with the overall project lifecycle in offshore wind farm development?
So typically the G&G, geophysical and geotechnical activities actually start quite early in the project development phase. Here in Taiwan, to meet the government requirements, we'd normally undertake a light geophysical EIA survey, probably 4 years before any construction activities commence. And this would be followed the next year by first phase proper geophysical survey, which would involve both seabed and seismic surveying. And that would instigate the preparation of a preliminary ground model. During that same year as well, what we now like to do also is undertake a first phase geotech as well. Now, previously that might have just been CPTs, but more and more nowadays with the, let's say, the tighter engineering timelines, obtaining soil samples early to get the soil samples into the laboratory at that early phase is now becoming quite a critical path requirement. So for the current wind farm that we're developing, we did this Geophys 1 and Geotech 1 in 2022, and we would do the soil investigations to varying depths, 60 to 100 meters below seafloor. As I mentioned, with these engineering timelines becoming more and more compressed, then this obtaining of soil samples in this first phase of geotech is a bit of a step away from the tradition, taking them at a later stage. But then the data that we collect and the results that we get actually then get fed into the ground model, updating it all along. So then when we come to the following year, which is normally when we see a final wind turbine layout, we can then target the specific wind turbine locations. And generally we'll do that with CPTs only, because we've already taken the soil samples that we need the previous year. And we'll also do another geophys campaign, typically a UXO survey. So all in all, we've normally got two good full coverage geophys data sets, which will help in the interpretation of seabed mobility. We've got underwater cultural heritage considered and taken care of, and also unexploded ordnance as well. So typically that means you've got 2 solid years of geotech and geophysical investigations prior to construction starting. It is, and it also depends on the client as well. I mean, again, if you've got the major oil and gas companies, then the scrutiny is there at 110% of the time. And typically, I did find maybe 10 years ago in Australia that the major oil and gas companies were hiring as HSE personnel just came out of university with degrees and just didn't have a clue how to actually manage HSE on an operational basis. I mean, when I came here, I found that it's a cultural thing. I worked in a company that was based in the south of Taiwan, and the HSE manager, he was lovely. He really, really was. You'd tell him something, he'd listen. He'd then relay the message on to the crew in Chinese, and he would speak forever. He could talk about it, but he couldn't see it. My typical day would be to take the ferry across to the place where the company's offices were. And I'd have to walk through the local street markets where you've got scooters going in all directions, you've got cars, people, and that's just like normal life. And I walked into the gate of where the office was, and vessel would be alongside, right next to the office. And as I was walking towards the vessel, I could see the HSE guy, and he's got a local contractor next to him. And the contractor was obviously there to do some repair or full modification on the back deck. And they were stood there happily chatting away, smoking, and they were right next to an oxyacetylene kit. And I was like, really? Do you realise that if something goes wrong here, you're not just taking yourselves out, you're taking the vessel out, this kind of thing? And then it's just oblivious to it, and that's the kind of change in awareness that is probably the most challenging thing with bringing people up to HSE standards and requirements for, let's say, the offshore wind industry.
It would take a long time, won't it?
I think 5 years is a realistic time frame. Simply because, I can remember when I first started for that company, I wrote them risk assessments. I introduced them to a risk matrix and how it worked. I basically copy and pasted the Fugro HSE way of doing things and tried to implement it in the company. And sometimes I was looked at as if I was stupid. Well, that's going to cost time. Well, we haven't got time to worry about that. And you just think, well, okay. So then you've got to try and attack it from a different angle. Well, if you do this and you can demonstrate it to prospective clients that you've got this, then you'll win more contracts. And then you'll see a financial benefit from actually having implemented these things. So, sometimes you have to appeal to different mindsets to actually get the message across.
Yeah, that's a very good point, which is in terms of out and safety or even if there's an injury, it's very different on that side of the world, isn't it? I think there's perhaps more accepted collateral to do things, whereas CA, of course, you would
for sure.
You would have agency. If something goes wrong, one, there's a reputation. Two, there's huge fines. Now, of course, where your employees potentially not going home, which is the biggest issue. But however, companies are actually focused, and they need people to be trying to be training in going home again, because it doesn't look good if people don't get to go home at the end of the day.
No, and I think that's the message that's really, really trying to be pushed across, So many companies have their buzzwords, their golden rules, what have you. I think here in Taiwan, we have quite a strong one of the Danish HSE guys. He said something about, a kid saying, I want it to be safe to send my dad to work and see him again in the evening. And I think that can actually make people think a little bit more. when you start bringing in your children, your family members, and having them as part of the equation of you having an accident or not having an accident at work due to safe working practices and safety awareness, then people do buy into it a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, it's a great way of doing it, because you're not just a worker, you're many other things.
Definitely. I mean, again, going back to when I was in Australia, we used to have our project inductions, and they'd last for 2 days, and the amount of HSE, environment talk, and what have you, you need to make it impactful. If you make it too much, then you're just talking to brick walls, because people tune out. They look at their phones. They're still, thinking about what they did the night before, what they're going to do that night, and so it's got to be delivered in such a way that you're actually making people understand, making people listen, and then it actually has a meaning, and it results in better performance. So getting that balance right is a good thing. And I think,
engagement.
Engagement is a good thing. I saw a transition in the way things were done from talking at people, non-stop talking at people, stop for 10 minutes at 10 o'clock in the morning for a tea and a coffee, talk again till lunchtime, stop for half an hour, talk again till the end of the day. No good. But then moving into having groups of people and scenario-based questioning, and what would you as a group do about this situation? It's an emergency or what have you. And then people really, really start to buy into it, and they start to talk about it. And the more they talk about it, the more they understand it. The more they understand it, the more it becomes part of their way of thinking. And then that does transfer into operations at a certain point.
So I would just mention, for HS2, I was working with an engineering geologist on HS2. We had to go down to London, and we had a health and safety kind of briefing on who was used to specifically working. But they had to talk about it, and they were trying to go for some role play, and then you were open up questions, all really just some of the fact they're not technical, it's just pick them up really, like what do you think the answer is. But it was a really good way, because it was actually quite entertaining to watch that and then to all be involved. And then actually, to be honest, they had a nice little lunch spread as well, which always helped. But it was a really good way of doing it. And that's the only time I've ever been, anywhere near something like that. Most of the time, it is just sit here for an hour, read through that, or just it's got the same stuff, just what you're used to, just sign that. And then Jeff Garm was getting to work stuff, because you'll have to get the seats done, release the strength in there. Well, companies to get an invoice at some point to get paid. So it's very much a commercial, aspect there as well. But yeah, the HS2, hats off to them in order for their health and safety. That was really interesting one.
Yeah, I think that behavioural based training is a better way of getting people to engage, for sure. I mean, I look at some of the offshore or onshore operations in Australia, and people would fly from Perth to wherever it was they were going to either join a vessel or join an onshore operation. They arrive in a new town. First thing they're going to do is say, "Oh, I've got an induction tomorrow. Okay, let's go out for a few beers tonight." So first of all, they're turning up, slightly a bit tired, a bit worse for wear. And then if you just drone on at them all day about HSE, then you're just going to be looking at blank faces, or even worse, you're looking at the top of people's heads because they've fallen asleep.
Can you share some insights on the recruitment and developing of the young talent in Taiwan's offshore wind industry?
For Wood Thilsted, we actually like to visit the local universities to provide an overview of what we do as a company in Taiwan, which is mainly survey management and engineering. Our recruitment policy has needed to change over time, as we found that the offshore wind industry at the moment is quite competitive, with the recruitment of good quality people actually coming at quite a premium, because people are able to pick and choose their next role. They fancy working in Korea for 2 years, and they can go to Korea, Japan, back to Europe, for instance. So we turned our attention to actually the recruitment and development of good local young graduates. And I have to say, it's really paid dividends. Our SI team here now comprises 4 of these really amazing Taiwanese. And to be honest with you, I turn up on a Monday morning and they never cease to amaze me, full of enthusiasm, positive attitudes, smiles, how are you feeling? 5 out of 5 every week, and it does keep an old dog like me, enthused, and I feel, really comfortable with letting them do their day-to-day work. And all they need from me is, minor supervision, glance here and there. And the good thing is we work well as a team, and also we find time to socialise as friends too.
To arrive on a Monday morning and find an enthusiastic workforce, that's pretty good. I don't get that too often.
Yeah. No, but I get it every week, so I'm lucky.
You're used to it now. That's it.
I'm so used to it now. When one of them actually turns up not looking full of beans, I actually wonder why. It's odd to see it.
Finding the right staff is hard, really hard. At GI Rec Limited, we understand the ground investigation market inside out and can make all the difference to your recruitment woes. You need to concentrate on running the business, which is very difficult to do without the correct number of qualified staff. We can help you get your time back and lower your stress levels. We only work with talented, referenced, and often entirely exclusive candidates across the ground engineering sector. Wouldn't that be nice? It's not a dream, it's a reality for many of our happy customers. Get in touch with the team now to book a call. Just email info@girec.co.uk to book a call, or click the link in the show notes now.
What advice would you give to young engineers aspiring to work in the offshore wind industry?
I think whether it's the offshore wind industry or any aspect of SI or ground engineering, I think the first thing to do is turn up on day one with an enthusiastic attitude and a willingness to learn. I think flexibility, and please expect to learn things that are seemingly completely unrelated to what you've been taught technically in university. I think if you're given opportunities to work overseas on vessels or anywhere away from your home office, always consider them. The experience to be gained from working in different countries, different jurisdictions, different cultures, for instance, it's invaluable as you progress your career, and it helps you with your understanding of how to deal with situations based on the country or circumstances that you can sometimes find yourself in.
So how do you approach the training and the mentoring of your new employees?
I think at the end of the day, the lessons that I've learned from my own experiences, I can transfer across. With regards to when we have someone new join the company, first of all, we have an onboarding process, which is pretty standard for most companies. But I do tend to find that most of the people that join us, or all of the people that join us here in Taiwan, have got limited experience of understanding what offshore work is really like. A lot of people worked in university, but they don't have that actual hands-on experience of working on vessels. So I do like to try and encourage a week or two offshore, just so people know the difference between how time goes by in an office and how time goes by on a vessel. Because, if something goes wrong on a vessel, the last thing people on a vessel need is for the people in the office to be asking every 5 minutes, how's it going? How's it going? How's it going? When in all reality, things can take hours, if not days, to actually get sorted. So that's the first stage of their, let's say, exposure to how to manage an offshore operation. And then typically, depending on what time of the year they join, they'll join through one of the typical project life cycle phases. So we go from procurement into project preparation and mobilization into operations, and then into reporting. So over the course of their first year, they will have been exposed to all aspects of that project life cycle, and then you sprinkle a bit of the local Taiwanese government requirements or permitting issues, or like I said, mentioned earlier, the stakeholder problems, and that generally gives them a good first year of grounding into what's required.
Yeah, it's good that you kind of expose them to all the different facets of the business and the cycle from that first call or the completing and signing off the report. And to get that within a year, because some people work in an industry for years, they don't get exposed to all these elements of it. So it's really good that you do that within the first kind of year.
Yeah, for sure. And we show them all the glamorous bits, and we show them all the dirty bits as well. So they get a completely balanced overview of what's actually going to happen at some stage in the next 12 months.
In your experience, what are the critical components of an effective team?
Oh, I think this answer probably can cover any team leadership in probably any given discipline.
Yeah.
What I always look for when, first of all, we interview people and then offer them a position is that person going to fit in with the current team? And I think that's pretty standard across the board. Are they going to, add value to the team? Are they going to integrate well with the people that are already there? For me, the basics are, I do like to hope that I trust and support the team. And try and encourage and always provide recognition. I think these things are always really appreciated. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of positive feedback goes a long way to helping people feel comfortable and confident in the roles they're doing, so they know that if mistakes are made, it's not a problem. It's just part of that learning process. That there's no let's say, blame culture or, I've worked in various offices where you do sometimes feel a little bit intimidated.
So how do you approach the budget preparation and management for extensive offshore site investigations?
I think for the first project that we did here in Taiwan, which I became involved with in 2018, it was more a case of learning as we went, as there wasn't that much in the way of ability to benchmark costs, certainly not in the region. As time progressed, it was obviously easier to estimate costs based on the previous experiences. And that certainly made preparing the DevEx budget for G&G far easier and generally more accurate. One thing that you can never really get a true feel of is weather downtime on offshore operations. It's always a bit of an unknown factor. And you can use statistical analysis as much as you want, but the experience is that it's difficult to estimate those costs. But like I said, I think as we've gone along, this is now on the third project that I've worked on here in Taiwan. I'm about to go into the fourth. Then our budget estimates are pretty accurate. But in these times, certainly in the last year or two, costs certainly being scrutinised more. So every time we prepare a budget, we always have to try and find ways to just reduce it where we can.
Sure. So you mentioned the weather down process. We've had a couple of engineers working offshore, kind of arrive on the vessel, get into location, and then it's just a little bit too rough. So they'd have to wait a couple of weeks sometimes to carry on, which seems great because they're obviously getting paid a reasonable amount of money to be there. But 2 weeks dropping about in a vessel can take a toll, can't it?
Oh, for sure. I've done jobs myself. I did a party chief job on a vessel in the North Sea in 2017. I was there for 4, maybe 5 weeks. I spent most of it in Floro in Norway. Beautiful place, but the scenery got very, very boring after a while, I have to say. And like you say, it's even worse if you're in kind of marginal conditions on site where you just maybe can or cannot work, and then you're just bouncing around, and a swell comes through, and you hear all the clatter of cutlery and plates in the galley, and it's not a pleasant experience for sure.
Can you explain the processing criteria for selecting contractors and managing contract or site investigation?
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, government localization requirements do limit the pool of geotechnical and geophysical contractors here in Taiwan. Unlike the larger packages in an offshore wind project team, such as cables, foundations, the site investigation team here also manage the procurement and the contract management. So we're actually involved right from the tendering phase. We evaluate tenders, we shortlist contractors, and then we make the recommendations to the project steering committee for contract award. The things that actually get looked at when evaluating tenders here, cost always is quite a high one, but we also look at the contractor's track record, their technical compliance, certainly HSE, previous experience that we have of working with those contractors. Are they sometimes collaborative to work with? Do they sometimes cause us, let's say, project management issues. So with all things considered, we certainly don't always go for the cheapest option. One thing that we also do is we negotiate our own contracts, which certainly makes managing them far more easy than having someone else, for instance, hand them over to you already negotiated when operations begin. So the projects here will have a standard contract template, and we have a very, very good legal team that we work with. But certain things in contract lend themselves better to certain requirements. So, for instance, G&G contracts need to take into consideration, the operational ability of being able to look at a contract clause and say, is it actually workable? There's no point having a clause in a contract if it just completely stops you from doing something. So, it has to have that, a degree of operational know-how when it comes to actually, final negotiation of the clauses to actually make sure it's a contract that both the contractor and us as clients can actually use and manage a successful operation.
In your opinion, what are the key factors for successful business development with a geotechnical offshore wind sector?
I think one of the most important things is actually creating relationships. I think this is a really good starting point, and also building, a good reputation for quality and professionalism, and certainly being able to talk knowledgeably about your so-called area of expertise. I think after 6 years of undertaking the geophys and geotech survey management here in Taiwan, our team can really convey this level of knowledge and answer any questions that come our way from prospective clients. We can then also take this knowledge of working in this emerging jurisdiction in Taiwan and apply the lessons learned from that to other APAC markets, for instance. One of which is the Philippines, which at the moment is showing really good potential for the development of offshore wind to take off.
So you're saying how it's an emerging market over there in Taiwan. Do you think over the next 5 to 10 years they're going to be able to recruit as many staff as required?
I suppose, looking at Taiwan, I guess it is now more mature. It has been more than 10 years, I guess, now since offshore wind was first discussed here. So maybe I'm doing it an injustice by calling it an emerging market. I think that, when I look at it from the starting here in 2018, then it was an emerging market. Mm-hmm. So maybe the lessons that were learned back then are the lessons that can be applied to the likes of the Philippines or other markets. Taiwan, it's now 6 years since the first grid was awarded here. So maybe it's more of a mature market than I first made.
What trends are you observing in the offshore wind industry, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region?
Okay, so I think globally, it looks like the market has had a bit of a reset if what you read on LinkedIn is correct. But I think the consensus is there's still a few bumps in the road to navigate, but the future seems to be looking more positive than it was, say, 12 months ago. In APAC, there are certainly challenges which need to be overcome. Here in Taiwan, the strict localization requirements definitely do challenge developers' business cases. It does need a lot of head scratching prior to submitting bids in auction rounds. Cost escalations, delays, they're quite common in Taiwan. And this does have a knock-on effect to later developments. Be interesting soon because there's going to be a new government formed here in May, which follows on from the recent presidential elections. So it will be interesting to see if there's any notable changes to these localization requirements. And that might reinvigorate the market here a little bit. Let's see. I think I mentioned earlier that I'm also involved in some early development work for offshore wind in the Philippines. There does seem to be a lot of potential there. Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, all areas where offshore wind development is underway, was in the early stages of development. And maybe one day Vietnam will join the party after a few delays. I still hope, for me personally, that I can continue working in the offshore wind industry in APAC until I'm actually ready to hang up my boots. So I'm hoping for another good 5 or 10 years for sure.
And when you hang up your boots, do you think you'll stay in Taiwan? Do you think you'll head back towards the Europe area?
Nope, Taiwan is home for me. I have no intentions of leaving. So this is where I will happily retire and put my feet up. I just love the humidity and being hot and sticky all through the summer.
Especially at night, I find, when we're over there.
Oh,
In the
nighttime,
evening, it's
daytime, I
horrible.
don't really care. Yeah, I don't distinguish between the two.
Yeah, I think there's not much thing to be made, I don't think. Okay, so looking forward, what are the major developments and innovations you anticipate in the geotechnical field, particularly relating to renewable energy projects?
Yeah, so I mean, I think new and innovative solutions, basically to design and build wind farms in deeper water depths, will open
Okay,
up more opportunities to develop wind farms. I think floating wind seems to have its challenges at the moment, so maybe there's some focus on creating foundation solutions that works in deeper water depths and the current limits for the fixed bottom foundation solutions. Um, I know Wood Thilsted, it's already developed its own in-house software to optimize foundation designs far more quickly than other designers can. And this is maybe an area where further optimizations could be made. Um, One thing I do like to see is new equipment coming onto the market in the offshore geotech sphere. I see Fugro have recently released a new bit of kit called the Blue Snake. Someone I know has worked with it recently and
okay,
says quite, complimentary things about it. The ability to actually conduct co-located piston cores, CPTs, and also obtaining soil thermal properties at the same time. Actually, it probably will positively change the way that cable corridor investigations are undertaken, and it certainly help with cable burial risk assessments in the future in a good way.
so you mentioned there about foundations being at different depths and being deeper, essentially. What's the difference in terms of the design of the foundations at a much deeper level?
Oh, that's probably taking me a little bit out of my comfort zone. I think for floating wind, you're looking at these deeper water depths. You're looking at being able to anchor this floating foundation, which obviously comes with quite a few challenges, I think, because there's a lot of cables that are used to anchor to the seabed. They tend to have a bit of a crisscross pattern to them. To be honest with you, it's not an area I'm very, very strong with. I do have colleagues that know a lot better than me, and when they talk, it just kind of makes my mind boggle at times as to
Sure.
some of the complexities that actually are involved with the design of certainly floating foundations. So I can only imagine that it's far more complicated and costly and more time consuming for floating wind than it will be for fixed bottom.
How do you anticipate the offshore wind sector evolving in Taiwan over the next decade, and what role do you see for geotechnical engineering?
So looking at Taiwan now, the offshore areas available for fixed bottom constructions in Taiwan are slowly becoming used. So the step to deeper water is going to come sooner rather than later. The recent round 3.2 auction bid submission earlier this week, we'll see wind farms with grid connection in about 2029 or 2030. And then we'll be looking at the next auction round, the round 3.3, and that'll be on us soon. And I think that is where we'll start seeing the first floating wind farm developments being used in bid submissions. So I think from a geotechnical engineering perspective, the way that we collect data and interpret the data for fixed bottom will inevitably change for this new floating technology. And I guess one of the questions we need to know is, is the industry ready for these floating wind farm developments? I'm sure that there are clever people out there. I suspect there's many clever minds hard at work looking to ensure that there is a transition from fixed bottom to floating in both Taiwan and the rest of the world. I guess time will tell.
Well, that brings us to the end of the podcast. I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming on, sharing your knowledge. I've learned a lot. I'm sure the listeners and viewers will learn a good amount too. But thanks very much for taking the time out.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I hope that we can inspire more people to join the industry, because it is a good industry. You do get to travel the world, and sometimes you even have a bit of money left over at the end of the day for a few beers.
Perfect. Thanks very much for your time, Simon.
Thank you, Michael.
thanks for listening to this episode of the Ground Investigation Podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, then please support the show by leaving it a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts. For more information on what was discussed in this episode, click the link in the show notes now.